I think we all remember watching the Season 7 premiere of The Walking Dead for the first time. It's probably the most infamous episode in the show's history and pulled in a record-shattering 20 million viewers worldwide. And as we know, Negan would line up our survivors and brutally kill fan favourites Glenn and Abraham, leaving many absolutely devastated. But what if it had been different that night, and Negan had selected somebody other than Abraham to kill first in the lineup? Well, this is what if Negan killed Rick Grimes. After Rick is killed, without a doubt, Daryl still punches Negan. In fact, he'd probably attempt to strangle him. And after an uncontrollable Daryl is eventually taken away by the Saviours, Negan selects a second member of our group to die as a consequence for his actions. And once again, just like in the show, I think Abraham would be selected. He poses the biggest physical threat to Negan, and I think that would ultimately be the decider. So sorry Abe, even in this alternate timeline, you still meet your fate at the hands of Negan. The fallout of Rick's death would be colossal though. He was the undisputed leader of our group and the ideological driving force. For many of the characters in the show up to this point, Rick was all they knew as a leader. He was their sense of community and identity, so without him, I think the group would struggle immensely for a period of time, with characters like Glenn, Maggie and Michonne starting to assume the role of leaders after his death. And although murmurs of a revolution against the Saviours would probably brew amongst like Sasha, Rosita, Carl and Michonne, ultimately I think it would largely be stamped out by characters like Glenn and Maggie, who realise they don't have the supplies or weapons at this point in time to fight against the Saviours. So Alexandria as a community would reform to the Saviours' conditions and still hand over their supplies. I do however think we'd see, just like in the show, Carl going to the Sanctuary, but this time to try and avenge his father. But with Rick now dead, Carl doesn't hold that same strategic value he held when Rick was alive, so I don't think Negan would be as lenient towards him because he'd recognise him as a genuine threat. And vengeance is one hell of a driving force. For the sake of the video though, we will assume Negan lets Carl live just like in the show, and he ends up back in Alexandria. So the group are split. Characters like Sasha, Rosita, Carl and Michonne want to fight against the Saviours, but characters like Glenn and Maggie are probably more concerned with the amount of casualties an all-out war would cause. I think Alexandria would be divided, but ultimately reform to the Saviours' conditions for a lot longer than we saw in the show. However, the turning point would be Daryl's escape from the Sanctuary. I think that would play out pretty much exactly as we saw on screen, and Daryl would lead the revolution against Negan. But before he could do anything reckless, I think Maggie and Glenn would talk him into recruiting other communities to help fight the cause, like Hilltop and the Kingdom. All-out war would commence, but this time Carl, still devastated by the loss of his father, I think doesn't have this sudden epiphany to help others and build a better world, and is instead driven by this fixation on killing Negan. So that means he's never going out to help Sadiq and therefore never gets bitten, surviving in this alternate timeline, at least for now. With no Rick, our group never discovered Jadis and the Scavengers, at least for a while, as Rick is the one who led Aaron to the houseboat where they ultimately discovered the community. Also with Rick dead, Spencer doesn't try to overthrow him behind his back, meaning Spencer probably lives in this timeline and Rosita doesn't retaliate to his death by attempting to shoot Negan. Also meaning Eugene is never taken by the Saviours and some faulty bullets aren't going to save our survivors in this timeline. Now, it's basically just guesswork as to how the actual combat between the Saviours and a Daryl-led survivors would actually pan out in the show. But one thing is for certain, one of these two would end up dead. Like mentioned earlier, Carl never has this epiphany of wanting to build a better world. With Rick dead, Daryl wants revenge, as does many of the others in the group. And Negan, well, during All Out War, he'd quickly realise he can't keep these people alive because they hate him so much. There would be no unification of communities or happy ending in this timeline. It would be a brutal clash, ending in mass casualties for both sides and either Daryl or Negan dying in my personal opinion. And realistically, because our survivors are quote unquote the good guys, for the sake of the narrative, they would have to win the Saviour War some way and somehow. Meaning that Negan would die. Because a Daryl-led army backed by the grieving characters of Sasha, Michonne, Carl and Rosita would vastly outnumber the more level-headed presences of people like Maggie and Glenn. And with no central leader, a decision like this, instead of falling into the hands of a singular person like Rick Grimes, it would most likely be decided by some kind of vote. And in this vote, I think Negan would be killed. Had the writers have killed off Rick Grimes, it would have affected the events of the series massively. I mean, that goes without saying. And also, without a doubt, we would have seen an even bigger drop-off in viewers than we actually saw in Season 7 after Glenn's death. But other characters would have to step up, as we would lose the main character of the show. Much like Season 9, I think we would see a couple of people start to get increased roles, but it's none other than Carl, who I think would see the biggest rise. With Rick now dead, Carl would be immediately thrust into a more prominent role, as he would be looked at to lead because he's the natural heir to Rick, despite him only being a kid, and this is where the character would probably have a similar storyline to his comic book counterpart, slotting in as our new main protagonist for seasons to come. So let's break down what I think would have happened thus far. The group fall into disarray after the death of their leader. With the majority wanting Negan dead, the two sides go to war and Negan is eventually killed. Glenn, Sasha and Carl all survive the ordeal in this timeline, and Eugene never switches alliances. Obviously, in order for the Saviour War to have some kind of tension, a few key characters would have to die to make some interesting TV. But I'm not going to predict those deaths here, as we would venture quite far off topic with me speculating deaths from a totally hypothetical battle. And I know this whole video is hypothetical, but I'm trying my best to stick to canon events that would be affected with Rick's death. So now we've explored how seasons 7 and 8 of the show would have changed, we can now speculate the reception from fans and the impact on the narrative moving forward. Killing Rick Grimes would have been one hell of a decision that would have been met with mass uproar from probably pretty much everybody who watched the show. But killing the character would mean AMC wanted to focus more of the story on Carl Grimes. However, as much as I love Chandler Riggs as an actor, he was not ready to be the face of the franchise. So not only would it have been a colossal mistake, but also narratively, the most engaging parts of seasons 7 and 8, in my opinion, is the Negan and Rick dynamic. Negan is the first person we see truly break Rick both physically and mentally, and it was a rude awakening for the group. Their relationship is a clash of two leaders fighting for their beliefs, and with Rick now dead, you lose arguably the best parts of seasons 7 and 8. On top of this, Negan's death at the end of season 8 in this timeline would then leave Jeffrey Dean Morgan absent from later seasons of the show. With no Rick and Negan, you lose two leaders from the series. As much as I love Carol, Daryl and Glenn, they are best served as side characters that shine in the shadows. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't think Carl was ready to take that leap into the sole lead of the show. I'm certain that killing Rick Grimes off at the lineup scene was never in question, and for good reason. Because even though characters like Glenn, Sasha, and maybe even Carl would have survived the ordeal, the show would have lost its identity. The Walking Dead is Rick Grimes, and we saw post-season 9 why exactly that is. He was the main focus driving the narrative forward, whilst embodying the key themes of the show, like family, survival, and morality. Losing him in season 7 would have done irreversible damage, and although it's fun to speculate, I'm so glad that the writers didn't do this. But now you've heard what I think would happen from a television perspective, I'm going to say what I think would happen in-universe. If you take away plot armor from our group and ignore the fact it was a series, the reality of Rick Grimes' death in-universe would probably mean the end of many of our characters. I think Carl and Daryl would become extremely reckless on a mission to kill Negan themselves and wind up dead. I think Glenn and Maggie would lack the authority to unite the communities to fight against the Saviors, and Alexandria would struggle without its central leader. However, I do think eventually Michonne would step up and take over. Ultimately, if you do remove plot armor from our group, after Rick's death, I think Negan would have ruled with an iron fist, and his reign of terror would have lived on. And we could have even seen the Saviors in an all-out war versus the Whisperers. But that's a video for a whole different day. In my opinion, the future of our group, if you take away plot armor, would be extremely bleak had Rick have been killed in the lineup. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. I would love to hear all your theories and who you think might die in an all-out war led by Negan and Daryl. As always, thank you so much for watching today's video, and if you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe as we are quickly closing in on 30,000 subscribers. With that being said, I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye.